Okay, we're going to get started here. Thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome to our webinar, Turning Real-World Evidence into Real-World Impact for MedTech Innovators. My name is Jim Goodmiller. I'm the Vice President of Client Services for our MedTech group here at BioBridges. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar for the community, really as an education process for us to really share some insights in a very crucial, important topic that's taking place around the country as we look at different ways in which real-world impact is affecting MedTech today. So again, thanks for taking time to join us. We think it's vital for us to really kind of talk to the industry about this because we feel it's important to really get some good guidance from an overall perspective, maybe some history on what has happened within real world evidence, and get some firsthand experience. And so I'm excited that the panel that we've assembled here today is fantastic. So we've got some great industry experts that we'll introduce, as well as some folks from the FDA that will share some of their insights as well. And so again, hopefully this will be a real good chance for us to get some learning out to the market. And I'd like to say kind of at the end, we will try to save some time if possible for some questions. And so if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat below. We'll have some folks that will be screening the questions, and we'll do our best to see if we have any time left to see if we can get to them. So great. So let's get started. So with that, I'd like to do a quick introduction of the panel. If you could go to that next slide there, Maggie. All right. So this is our distinguished panel that we have with us today. So I'll just read through each of them really quickly. So Julia Ward is the Chief Epidemiologist in the FDA's Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis and an expert in real-world data and regulatory science. Rebecca Torkson is the Associate Director of Evidence Generation at FDA CDRH with extensive hands-on experience in clinical research operations across academic and hospital settings. Heather Colvin is the Senior Director of International Harmonization at Johnson & Johnson MedTech, driving global regulatory harmonization and advancing real-world evidence in clinical research. Dawn Heimer is the VP of Clinical Research at Corvivo Cardiovascular. She's renowned expertise in regulatory strategy, real-world analytics across the top medtech companies. Stefan Ogenstad is an expert biostatistician at Statogen Consulting. Stefan has over 35 plus years of global pharma and academic experience and is a former chief statistical advisor to the Nobel Prize Committee. And last but not least is Manvi Sharma. Manvi is the Director of Real World Evidence at Chiors, accomplished researcher and pharmacist specializing in pharmaceutical health outcomes and policy. So again, thank you all for joining us. We could have probably talked for about an hour on each of your introductions, but thank you for joining us. We look forward to kicking this off. So as we get ready to dive in, I think the thing that we should start with is go to the next slide, Maggie. If you look at kind of the decision grade evidence on a startup budget, and we're going to turn this over to Dawn to kind of take it from here. But it's essential to understand how MedTech innovators are generating compelling decision-ready evidence, and especially with the constraints that kind of are around a lot of MedTech startups. And so Dawn's going to kind of lead us through a little bit of this topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dawn.
Thanks very much, Jim. So you stole my thunder a little bit on the title slide, but what I'm going to talk about today is how we can produce data that can withstand the scrutiny of regulators, investors, and our clinicians, even when we don't have a big budget. So we can build credible, defensible evidence on a skinny budget by prioritizing what drives quality data. Next slide. So this need we have for quality data is real. We can't all afford to fund a 5,000 patient registry or buy a data slice from one of the large associations. We need approvable data sets, competitive reimbursement, and the ability to make as many evidence-driven decisions as possible to be competitive and to thrive. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We'll show you how to win by pairing your clinical data with structured real world data. So when we think about what we need, we have approvable data sets. So data that we can submit to regulators and they will trust what we have to say. Competitive reimbursement. So data for payment structures that's as good as or better than the competition. And to make evidence-driven decisions. So these are the choices that we'd like to make based on data rather than assumptions or our gut. So I'd like you to take a minute in the chat. Please tell us what matters the most to you today so we can get a sense of where your interests are. So type 1 if you're most interested in approvable data, 2, data for reimbursement, or 3, data for decision making. Okay, great. So in the interest of time, I'm going to let those continue to accumulate. And if we can go to the next slide so I can keep talking while that data still comes into us. So let's talk a little bit about the clinical data that you have versus what we're calling real world evidence. So just to use an example, think of your data as a flashlight. It shines very brightly, but only in one narrow spot. Whereas real world data lights up the whole room. It can show you how patients actually use or receive your product, how the risks play out in clinical practice day to day, and other data that regulators want to know before they open the door wider to you. So is it fair to say that most of us have asked at some point, how many patients can we afford to enroll? Right? Raise your hand. I think there's a lot of us here. Now think about it in a real world data mindset instead. That then would be, what can we learn from every patient that's already in our records? So now we're going to talk about how to create real world evidence without needing a budget like Big Pharma. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about different methods and use an analogy of a ladder so that each activity or each rung is a low-cost step that you can take. Next slide. So let's start with our internal case series. So this is the data you already have that's sitting in-house. And start, if you haven't already, by building a spreadsheet of your patients, their procedures, their outcomes, and standardize it. This helps you to come up with patient narratives and case reports that are easier to generate and are consistent. So building a spreadsheet of this data is going to be an iterative process. So don't get frustrated if you've spent a lot of time entering data the wrong way, or you realize that you've forgotten an important variable, even though you thought you were done. This will be a learning process. So this exercise may show you some gaps in the data that you didn't notice before. And now that you're aware of them, you can work on explaining them or possibly a plan to fill them. So I'd like this presentation to be as useful to you as possible. So I've included a link here that is a free website that provides you a template for your case series. And turning your data into a case series gives you that first step towards turning your patient experience from anecdotes into real world evidence. Next slide. So rung number 2 here is external data sets. So what this is about is having credible comparators to put your data in context, meaning you want to be able to compare your case series to free or low-cost data sources. So again, I've provided some links. Here are some examples of data in certain therapeutic areas that might be relevant to your patient population that you can use for comparison. Now, there's more of these online. I just picked a few of them. And if it turns out there's a data set out there and it's a close match, but it's not as good as you would like it to be, think really hard about what's different between your data and the data set. So, what are the differences in the population? What are the differences in the setting? Meaning, is someone in the hospital? Are they in a doctor's office? That can influence the type of data that you're collecting. And also think about um, how you can use your data to refine your population by filtering it by certain categories. So then, if that still kind of leaves you thinking, oh, I wish it was still a better match, I'd say continue to look for some more databases. You'd be really surprised how much there is out there that's available. And it also may turn out that when talking about filtering your patients, you may need to filter them more than you originally thought so that you can still use one of these databases for comparison. Now, the importance of that is these external databases are like external benchmarks. So if they're similar enough to your cases, then you have some context for your data. And then we can move into the next slide, which is creating a plan. So, an evidence plan ties your clinical findings into business, regulatory, and reimbursement priorities. A well-crafted plan ensures that the data points you collect serve a strategic purpose. So whatever that is for you right now, is it accelerating a regulatory approval? Is it reimbursement? Is it decision making? So let's go into the components of a good plan. So first and foremost, define your purpose and your hypothesis. So think about what decision are you trying to inform with your data? Are you trying to understand safety, clinical utility, or outcomes? Now, this first step may seem very obvious, and maybe even some of you think that we don't even need to talk too much about this because we know what it is. And I would challenge you to think really hard uh, to confirm that you really do understand what it is that you're trying to do and that the team that you have is aligned with that as well. Because you'd be surprised when you ask around the boardroom table about the purpose and the number of different answers that you're going to get. So number two in the plan is to define your cohorts. So this gets back to the comparator data sets we talked about on the previous slide. So we're looking for these external data sets that are representative of your patient population. They're reliable and appropriate for your question. So that's going back to number one, what is it that you're trying to inform with your data? So then step number three is to scope the research and approach what's needed to conduct a robust analysis. So when you think of your data and comparing it to an external database, you need to address things like age and prior therapies and comorbid conditions, which could be confounders to understanding the data and making those comparisons as strong as possible. You need to conduct data checks for completeness and consistency of the data. So you need to think to yourself, what is maybe the minimum amount of data that you need in order to include a patient in your data set? So maybe you have a data set of 50 patients, but you have incomplete data on 10 of them. You need to seriously consider if they stay in the database or if you put them aside to, again, to strengthen your opportunity for comparison and to also increase the quality of your data. So then the last step in the plan is to plan to create a credible package of your results. And this is super important. So you need to document the process that you followed and create auditable results. So what that means is someone else needs to be able to trace the process that you followed, reconstruct it, and verify it. And another important point when we're talking about small data sets, remember when you're drawing conclusions to interpret your data in context and be honest about its limitations, because you will lose credibility very fast if you talk too highly of your data more than it actually shows. Next slide. So now we move on to designing and conducting a formal study. So you need to start with a protocol template. I've included a couple of links below, but there are many online. And sometimes you just need to see a good example to make some of the ideas that you have kind of gel together. But what's helpful about a template that already exists is you're less likely to omit something that could be very important. And, certainly you can customize these to your product, to your therapeutic area, but let somebody else do the heavy lifting and use a template that's already out there. So an important point of quality real-world evidence is pre-specifying the analyses that you're going to conduct. So this will be outlined in your protocol. And you will also describe how you're matching your patients to the external database and to endpoints that FDA and other regulators expect as much as possible. You need to document your data sources and how you filtered them or how you defined them for your study. Again, thinking so that someone else could reproduce this. If the hypothesis you have or the data set that you're working with and the study that you're creating is hypothesis testing or regulatory facing, consider posting it publicly before you analyze the data to show transparency. So maybe we are all familiar with clinicaltrials.gov, or if not, they have lots of tutorials as a part of their website to kind of get you familiar with that. And then there's also an interesting database on the European side called the HMA-EMA catalog. So this additional step of publicly posting your study adds a lot of credibility to your work. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this slide that there's a couple of links here for protocol templates. I've also included a couple of other links for best practices around data that are different than just the FDA guidance documents for real-world evidence. So just trying to give you a broader perspective on what's out there to help you do a good job. Next slide. So let's talk for a minute about when someone is evaluating your evidence, what is it that really checks the box for quality? So some of these points we've talked about already. So first up here is, were the endpoints in the analyses pre-specified? Was the population clearly defined? Were the outcomes validated? Are you using measures that people are familiar with, or have you created your own assessment that makes a difference in how reliable people see the data? Were you able to address confounders? And is it reproducible and is it auditable? Next slide. So then this is the last rung here on external validation. So what you'd like to do when you're done with your study is compare your outcomes to what's already been published to show your relative performance. So meaning that you want to look for similar endpoints in similar patients and show that you're doing just as well or maybe even better. So here's an example just to be a little bit more specific. So let's say, for example, this is a surgery study, and one of your data points is your rate of ER visits out to 30 days. And in your data set, your range is 7.8. And you look in the literature for comparable studies, right? Comparable meaning similar endpoints, similar patients. And in the literature, it shows 10 to 12%. And back to what do we mean by similar patients? My example here is maybe they have the same baseline ASA score, which is a physical health questionnaire, and pain VAS. So think about clinical variables for your patients that are meaningful to describe their complexity and their health status. So then I've provided here some links to summaries of different types of data that you can take a look at. Again, you may find something that's right up your alley in your therapeutic area, which is really nice. And again, these are just a few examples. There's many more out there. And so the benefit of this external validation is placing your small data set in a context that people can trust. So you're going to present your outcomes alongside reputable external rates using shared definitions and trusted methods. So now think to yourself, after what we've spoken about, if you had 20 cases, 20 patient cases, and an external benchmark, what decision could you make next month? Okay, next slide. So circling back to some of the values of real-world evidence, we've got the regulatory component, which is using the evidence to supplement small studies or support post-market commitments. It can help us with market access, with paired dossiers, showing real-world cost offsets, and even if your data set is very small. And then lastly here, clinical adoption. So key opinion leaders and societies respond to practice-based evidence as much as they do trial data. So don't minimize the opportunity here for real-world evidence. Next slide. And so this is the conclusion of my talk. And you may remember at the beginning, I asked you to put in the chat what matters most to you today. And now I'd like you to think that we're at the end of the conversation and ask yourself again, because maybe that has changed a little bit. At least I hope it has. So thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. That was very great. That was great. Thanks for all of that insight. A couple of quick things. Again, I know Dawn referenced some downloadable links. Obviously, we will be putting those links together for everyone to send out so that you can get a copy of those as well. And then again, just as a reminder, if you have other questions that come up, if you want to drop them into the chat, please do so. All right, so moving on, we're going to go talk with Heather Colvin. Heather's going to dig into kind of the history and evolution of, excuse me, real world evidence and data and the policy that's around that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Heather.
Okay, thank you so much. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So first, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today and wonderful talk, Dawn. I'm going to steal your slides. But I also feel like we can touch back and forth to many of the points that Dawn made to kind of the policy perspective and the policy components that exist around real-world evidence and real-world data. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the what, why, where, and how is real-world evidence and real-world data being used. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So what is real-world data and what is real-world evidence? And I think you can ask multiple people and you're going to get a variety of different definitions. But I'm going to use strictly those definitions that exist within the current sets of policies that exist out there. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So these are the definitions that are from the FDA, CDRH, and CBER and CEDAR guidances that have been released over the last few years. And just so you know that these definitions have been more broadly adopted by other regulators as well. So they kind of set the benchmark. But the very first set of definitions came out in 2016 and then was finalized in 2017 with the FDA's guidance document on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory activities. So real-world data, this definition may seem broad, but it is intentionally so. It is data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of care routinely collected from a variety of sources. I point out that it's broad because one of the challenges we had was there's concerns about these new and emerging sets of data sources. Every time you look around the corner, new technologies exist and they're generating data. So this definition was by design intended to be more broad. So as new types of real world data emerged, the definition was flexible enough to include them. And then through rigorous and reliable analytical methods, many of which Dawn touched on in her talk, we then develop real world evidence, which is strictly speaking very straightforward. It is clinical evidence regarding the use, potential benefit, or risks of medical products derived from the analysis of that real world data. So these are kind of the key definitions that you'll see out there. But you will see it used more broadly, and you will often see real world data and real world evidence used sometimes interchangeably. But I think it is very important to keep them different because real world data is just data, and real world evidence is real world data that has been transformed into actual evidence. Next slide, please. So here's a quick map of the different types of real world data sources. And I've tried to circle and highlight those which are the most commonly used. I'd like to highlight that within medical devices, often in the past, the only types of data sources, and as Dawn alluded to, was the use of registries, these pre-specified data sources often through clinical societies. But as we moved to the digitization of our healthcare system, we began to see the digital data being more broadly collected. And in that top line, you'll see that those are the different clinical care settings and where real world data has been collected, primary care specialists, hospitals, etc. And often that data is collected in what is charged. So in insurance charges, there is a through claim that goes to close claims. And those closed claims can be used for real world data as well as then electronic medical records as they became more accessible and interoperability is improving. Data can then be used and linked from the claims data to the more clinically rich electronic health records. You also potentially could have access to labs and pharmacy data. But we also should look at those new and emerging data sources I mentioned before. We have medical devices that are generating data on the device itself. We have the use of surgical videos and radiographic images as real world data sources. And then all of the new patient-generated data sources that are becoming more broadly used. And that doesn't just include the watches and the apps that we're using, but also the use of digital therapeutics. I want to mention, though, that one of the key challenges we continue to face with real world data is device identification. And so that's why I have Waldo hanging out there, because where is the UDI or the unique device identifiers is often one of the key challenges that we face. We have found alternative methods outside of UDI being captured in the healthcare system, but it is one consideration that you will need to think about is, can you identify the device or devices of interest in your data sources? Next slide, please. So one of the things that I also wanted to talk about was the FDA's perspective. And while we have people from the FDA here on the call, and we can talk to them during the Q&A, I think it's important to think about what they've presented in the past. So I stole this slide from one of their colleagues, Daniel Caños, who really likes to do this crosswalk between the pivotal clinical investigations guidance document and the real world evidence guidance document. And those key considerations, many of which John just talked about, is what is the rationale for the study? Are you identifying your study endpoints? What is your treatment group? Is there appropriate consideration of the missingness of the data, data quality, misclassifications, definitions, and data accrual? And then also, what are the analytical methods that are being used? So when people talk about real world data as if it's something, or real world evidence as if it's something completely new and different, you need to make that crosswalk between what a traditional clinical or pivotal clinical investigation would include. There is a crosswalk to the real world evidence guidance document. If you could click forward. One more slide, please. So some of the key points I want to highlight is that there was the 2017 version that came out, which was the very first regulatory guidance for real-world evidence. In 2023, FDA issued a new draft guidance, which was greatly expanded upon. And some of the key points in that expansion, I'm going to highlight here. I should mention that while the 2023 guidance is out, it has not been finalized. So the 2027 version is technically the version that is still in force. But the 2023 provides a lot of additional information, which I highly recommend you use. So some of the key aspects of it is they provide a much greater clarification on how they are looking at data relevance and reliability, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They also provide a broader set of definitions of what real-world data sources could include, and they've explicitly included those patient-generated health data sources that I mentioned before, and also public health data sources. And this is important when you think about the COVID-19 response, that many of those public health surveillance sources were used to support IVDs and the regulatory indications for those. There's a greater number of RWE use cases that were included, and you'll see in the appendices there are examples of how real-world evidence has been used that they specifically cite. And the key thing for me is that they very clearly talk about those good research practices, many of which you've just heard about from Dawn. So this is important that they're trying to reinforce good research practices that are specific to real-world evidence development. And also, I should mention that they are a greater clarity on what are the expectations for what should be included in the submission and where they should be included in the submission. So that's an important note that when you're doing your submission, look at that guidance document. Next slide, please. So one of the key features and advances was in how they discussed the evaluation for fit for purpose or fit for use of real-world data. And they've categorized it in two sets of considerations. The first of which is data reliability. And the way to think about that is the assessing and characterization of the real-world data source, the source itself, whether it be a registry, whether it be an electronic health record. The source, you need to look at the accuracy of the data, the completeness, and the traceability of that data of the source. And then the next step is looking at the data relevance to your study question, which is, are those individual data elements relevant towards or reliable and relevant towards your study question? That's when you look at availability, the potential of data linkages, timeliness, and also the generalizability of it. And you can see that there are some sources linked below. But this new advanced or more fully fleshed out criteria is an important step in the guidance document. Next slide, please. One of the key things that I really want to highlight is that some people get hung up on certain aspects of it, and they start talking about the data sources and talk about the quality of the data sources as if that is the only thing that you have to take into consideration. The other piece that is equally as important is you need to start with a firm understanding, as Dawn highlighted, what is your study question? And then you look at your data sources to determine what data sources might be appropriate. And once you've done that data source assessment on the relevance and reliability, you can then look at additional analytical methods. So it is that kind of Venn diagram of what is your study question, what are the appropriate data sources, and then what are the appropriate analytical methods to address issues of bias, missingness, etc. And it's those three things that you need to look at. So next slide, please. Nope. Yeah. So one of the things is the why. So I feel like Dawn really covered this, but I really want to talk through why are we using real-world data sources? We often talk about, the current set of clinical traditional study approaches, and it is really important that those approaches be there and be solid and sound, and they do provide us with important information, but we also need to acknowledge the limitations. Traditional study approaches often have limited generalizability to broader populations because of their inclusion-exclusion criteria. They don't capture those key populations that Dawn mentioned. Sometimes they're not able to get to those long-term safety outcomes or considerations. And sometimes traditional clinical trials are just not feasible or ethical in certain populations, particularly in pediatric populations, pregnant women. Those are and rare diseases. So real world evidence becomes a real opportunity to expand and look at those populations that would have been impractical or infeasible to study in the past. Next slide, please. So now how is it being used? No, go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really important is that FDA has done a tremendous amount of work over the last 10 years in trying to understand the various aspects of how real-world evidence has been used and is currently being used and could potentially be used to support regulatory decisions. There is a report that came out in 2021, which is a compilation of 90 different examples of FDA submissions or submissions to FDA where FDA determined that real-world evidence was a key component of that regulatory decision. The exciting thing about it is that it does cover products throughout the total product life cycle, soup to nuts, how real-world evidence was used as a key component. It includes all the submission types, PMAs, supplemental PMAs, 510Ks, de novos, humanitarian device exceptions, and also humanitarian device exception conversions. And that there was examples in every single one of the review divisions. So this shows the breadth and depth. Some of the challenges is that it was a limited capture because there was no automated way for the FDA to get this information. They had to go through and manually collect it. So it is a convenient sample, but it is one that provides us some real insights. Next slide, please. So when you look at this, I want to highlight where did we find the vast majority of the regulatory submissions using real-world evidence. And not surprising, the cardiovascular space had the preponderance of the studies, with 51 of those 90 studies being done there. And I think that that's important because it is built upon, many of those were built upon some of the registries that had been in place for many years. And so they had been doing that ongoing data collection and allowed them to start collecting potentially for safety purposes or for a post-approval study, and then allowed them to collect that information to broaden indications, change labeling and instructions for use at various different settings. We do see examples in some of the other spaces where, in IVDs in particular, I think it's important. I'm not sure where all the different groups are. So if you wanted to pop into the chat what area or therapeutic area you're interested in, it would be great to see kind of where that overlaps with this map. And I highly suggest you go into that 2021 report and look at some of those studies in your therapeutic space. Next slide, please. I pulled out a couple of examples, or a few examples from that 2021 report that I think highlight some interesting ways that real-world evidence studies have been used. If you could go to the next slide. And one of the key things is that it is not one real-world evidence study to rule them all, completely replacing a traditional clinical study. What we see is that real-world evidence is part of your totality of evidence, and it can be used in a variety of different ways. For example, we saw examples of real-world evidence being used to support traditional clinical studies as external controls. The real-world evidence was used in several examples where they used real-world evidence to establish objective performance measures. One example of that was the MySight one-day soft contact lens that is used as a daily wear contact lens for the correction of myopia in children. They used the real-world evidence to establish the rates of infections as part of an objective performance measure that they then used as a comparison in their to their clinical trial. And then also, interestingly, we did see some mention of using real-world data as priors in Bayesian models. So there's also examples of post-approval safety. So we see a number of them where instead of doing a traditional post-approval study, they were able to use registries and leverage those pre-existing information. We also can see examples in the EU where they're for the post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF studies are using real-world evidence to support those ongoing clinical safety assessments that are required as part of the new EU MDR. And then there's also some interesting samples that are not included in the report as well that really look at how do we address some emerging safety concerns. So one example that comes to mind was a study that was done in a consortium of different manufacturers in the orthopedic space, where there was an emerging concern around the use of cobalt in hip and joint implants. So there was this comprehensive study that did a meta-analysis looking across various real-world data studies and found that there was understood risks about the cobalt and cancer risks. And that study was used to support new labeling changes and also establish safety requirements around this new emerging safety concern. And so those are some of the ways that it's been used in the past, but I also think what we see changing is the use of real world evidence to support indication changes, where we have an expansion of product may come onto the market at the very high risk patients and then be expanded as it's used in broader populations, as we see clinical benefit to those populations. We know that there's a large number of products that are being used off-label in pediatric populations. So in that, there was an opportunity to collect that use that is not, we're not promoting the use of off-label, but we are capturing the use of how our devices are being used in everyday clinical settings. And those happen to be some pediatric populations. We can then use that information to support getting those indications on label. And then also expanding disease and therapeutic areas. Sometimes a product may come onto the market with one indication and then be expanded to another. One of the other things I wanted to highlight is that the clinical evidence is being more frequently used as part of a primary decision or more substantial part of a regulatory decision. In the past, it's been more supplemental secondary information, but we are seeing products coming onto the market using OUS data collected, let's say, in Europe, and it's a primary data source for the first decision in the US. We're also seeing the use of device-generated data and that patient-generated data. So this will get you thinking about the various ways that real-world evidence and real-world data can support your product throughout the total product life cycle. Next slide, please. I also think it's important to understand that this is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. And the US may have been the first, but they're not the last to start looking aggressively at the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory activities. Next slide, please. Here's a quick thumbnail of some of those guidance documents. I'm not going to go through them in depth, but I think you'll see that over the last 2 to 3 years in particular, we've seen an explosion of new guidance documents or updated guidance documents from different regulators. Key regulators that have guidance documents in place, of course, is the US, South Korea, Australia. Japan has guidance documents specific to registries, but we're also seeing more information coming out from other groups such as Singapore and the UK, where they're acknowledging the use of real-world data as a source of clinical evidence. So this is just a quick thumbnail of that it's not just the US, but if you're looking at a global product launch, these are some areas where real-world evidence can be more broadly supported. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. That was fantastic. Lots of great information there. And I think, again, very helpful to kind of get an overview of what's happening, not just US-wise, but also on a global footprint. So now we're going to turn the discussion over to Dr. Stefan Ogenstedt. And we're going to talk a lot about the data side of it now. So I think it's really important, as we talk about real world evidence, that we understand the data that's behind it. And I think we are fortunate to have Dr. Ogenstedt with us today to talk a little bit further about how data sourcing is used and some of the statistical consideration and challenges that take place. So I think he is off camera, but I believe we've got you there, Dr. Ogenstedt. So we'll turn it over to you now.
If you can hear me, I'm on. Very good.
We can hear you great. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice that so many people signed up and many from the FDA as well. That's great. So I'm going to talk about data sources and statistical consideration. If I can have the next slide. So real world data, what and why? So we've heard some definitions, but it's good to repeat sometimes. One definition is data collected outside of traditional randomized controlled trials, electronic health records, claims, for instance, claims from pharmacies, hospital, clinics, registries, and wearables. So a wearable could be, for instance, a vest that is put on, and there is an Israeli company, Sensible Medical. They put on that vest and they measure the pulmonary arterial hypertension and use that in order to devise how to treat, what kind of medication should be given. Registries. So why is it matters? It supports post-marketing surveillance, label expansions, pricing models. Next slide, please. So how to access real-world data? Well, there are different sources. One, open source, surveillance, epidemiology, and end results program, medical information, MART for intensive care, clinical practice research data links. There are also a lot of available commercial tools or sources. One called Optimum, which is a large US commercial healthcare database, including claims, electronic health records, and integrated medical pharmacy data. It's widely used in real-world evidence research. Another one is Flatiron. It's oncology-focused real-world data derived from electronic health records in US cancer clinics. It includes longitudinal patient-level data. And also we have the large CRO, IQVIA. Another one is Komodo, which is a commercial US healthcare data provider offering de-identified patient-level longitudinal health journeys. They're built from payer, provider, and claims data. Then we have also collaborations, health information exchanges, for instance, academic consortia, which are, of course, collaborations between universities, hospitals, and research centers to share data for clinical and translational research. And there is also provider data networks. The regulatory consideration, we have the HIPAA, we have the General Data Protection Regulation in EU, de-identified versus patient-level data. Next slide, please. So the data collection considerations, the structured or versus unstructured, and I will tell about one example how it has been dealt with this. Data quality, completeness, accuracy, timeliness, and missing data and imputations. So imputations is when you, without changing variability, you can add data points missing. You can do that at random, for instance, and you can use that to analyze the data now more as a complete data set. Linking data sources, we can link claims, electronic health records, and wearables, as I mentioned, with clinical data. Next slide, please. So what's the access to data, barriers and enablers? Legal issues, the data use agreements need to be in place. We have IRBs. We need to have consent from the patients. Technical interoperability and standardization. For instance, fast healthcare interoperability resources, the observation and medical outcomes partnership, common data models, which is very useful. Cost and time. There are cost and time considerations with licenses and data cleaning, curation. Next slide, please. So the takeaways from this is that real-world data can bridge gaps left by randomized controlled trials. So randomized controlled trials are very efficient to in order to determine causality and so on. But there many times, and I gave a talk in Savannah a few days ago about these things. The things are that the randomized controlled trials are perfect in a sense, but they are too perfect. They handle the patients and the data in a different way than many of the physicians. The physicians are going to be more rigid in a controlled randomized trial than in medical practice. Need to understand your data, where it comes from, how it behaves. Very important for the statistical analysis. Engage early with regulators, FDA, EMA, and payers on data acceptability. Next slide, please. So Palantir artificial intelligence platform. I worked on 18 legal cases as an expert witness, and Palantir was one. It had to do with trade secrets. What was under the hood? What does this system do? So it's a system about data integrity. So the platform integrates diverse data sources, including electronic health records, clinical trial data, and real-world evidence to provide a comprehensive view of potential trial sites. Predictive analytics, it's utilizing machine learning algorithm. That's the engine behind what we call AI. The system predicts site performance metrics such as patient recruitment rates, retention, and data quality, enabling informed decision-making. And site profiling. The artificial intelligence platform by Palantir conducts detailed profiling of clinical sites, assessing factors like historical performance, therapeutic expertise, and patient demographics to identify the most suitable locations for specific trials. So that's what this system does. It searches out patients that would be very suitable for the clinical trial. Operational efficiency. By streamlining the site selection process, the platform accelerates trial timelines and reduces operational cost, contributing to more timely and cost-effective clinical research. Next slide, please. So Palantir's platform does not itself generate real-world data. Instead, it integrates, curates, and harmonizes existing data sources such as electronic health records, claims, and registries to enable scientifically valid analysis and the generation of real-world evidence. When I started on this case, I thought the first month, because I programmed a lot and analyzed some 650 clinical trials, I thought this is impossible. I know how hard it is. This is impossible. But after about a month, I realized these guys did the impossible. They have done the impossible. So what's the engine behind? Well, they call it artificial intelligence, but what does it do? I don't know, because it's a trade secret. It was a big case about trade secrets. So they don't disclose. They didn't even have it written down in blueprints how the system does this, but it did. It was quite fantastic. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ogenstad. Appreciate that. Was very, very interesting. I think one of the things, let's see if I can get my video to work here. There we go. So I think one of the things that we take away from kind of this overview, we've set a foundation of, what is real world evidence? What is real world data? How does this impact decision grade evidence? If you're working through a startup budget. And so now we're going to turn this over to some question and answer with our colleagues from the FDA. So both Rebecca and Julia are both here to join us today. So we appreciate you guys taking your time out of this. I know There's not a lot going on at the FDA, I'm sure, right? It's not very busy, but we appreciate you taking time to help us educate the market on some of the things that are taking place. So, what I'd like to do is go through some questions that we could kind of start with to ask, and obviously get your take on some of the things that we've come up with. So, um, if I'd like to start with, obviously, given the 2021 examples report and some more recent experience with real world evidence submissions, has there been a significant increase in the use from what you're seeing using real world evidence to support regulatory submissions?
Yeah, I can take that. Thanks so much for having us today, and thanks for that question. So CDRH continues to support the use of real-world evidence throughout the total product lifecycle. And Heather captured really nicely in one of her slides the many places in the TPLC that RWD can contribute. But examples of that could include RWE use for hypothesis generation to inform prospective trial design, as a control arm for a trial, as a framework to support post-market evidence generation, or as evidence supporting indication expansions and future innovation. Our goal is to encourage the generation of high-quality evidence that can meaningfully inform regulatory decisions at any point in the TPLC. And our 2017 guidance provides the foundational framework for that work. It outlines how sponsors can demonstrate the relevance and reliability of RWD to generate credible and accurate RWE, and those same principles continue to guide our evaluation today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Another question is, how are sponsors using real-world evidence to support pre-market or post-market decisions? Maybe some insights into the differences with, different device classifications like PMA, 510K, or de novos. Maybe we'll start with that question first.
Yeah, sure. So I can take that one. I think, as Julia said, and we heard from Heather, the use of real data can be across the total product lifecycle, right? And we have some examples and that Heather mentioned that were published in 2021. And if you look at those, there are breadth of across the different submission types, PMAs, 510Ks, de novos. And I think each use is unique. But to kind of help provide some thoughts around what could be helpful to think about and where real world evidence could be helpful, there are kind of, we heard it a little bit today on good clinical practice, but also like good research practice, right? Is write down what you want to do before you do it. So how do you think, what is your study question? And is that study question going to be supporting your regulatory question you'd like to come forward? And can real world data help in that scenario? I think spending energy kind of digging too far into data and then developing your question can get a little bit tricky. So really kind of thinking through what you'd like to ask and what protocol aims and objectives, hypotheses, if you need them, would be helpful in demonstrating that. And then go and try to find a real world data source that would best suit answering those questions. Some common things that are thought about when thinking about putting that together and what real world data source might be best suited is if you need to find your device, as we heard from Heather, in the real world data source, can you do that? I think that's challenging. We know that there are devices that are being used all the time to deliver good quality healthcare to patients across the country, but making sure your real world data source is tapping into where that device use is being recorded is paramount. And then for kind of understanding, you have potentially found a pot of patients where the device was used. Is that representative of this intended use population that you have for your regulatory question? So thinking about how to show that, how to think through that, and pre-specifying how you're going to do it. Second would be somewhat in the same vein of study population representativeness. The device use can be one piece of it, but also your inclusion-exclusion criteria also need to be very clear and concise to make sure that that patient population truly represents that intended use population. And then just another thought for consideration is if you have an outcome measure that may occur over time after the device use. I'll just make up something like a stroke after a device use or something might be an adverse event that you'd want to understand. understanding how well your your real world data source ascertains the continuity of care that is being provided to the patient in a reliable way, right? Are you looking at just one EHR that might be a very high profile tertiary care center, but when patients have acute events, they may not travel all the way back to that place to get treated. They might have to go to their local ERs. And so making sure your real world data source actually has the ability to ascertain adverse events, if that's something of interest for your study question or your research question, is important. And I think to kind of get FDA's feedback, please know that we heard it here today, but come to us early and often for feedback, bring specific questions, and we can help guide those things with those conversations up front and help reduce the dollars spent by potentially giving our thoughts in the early phases of study development or RWD protocol development. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the insights into what study designs or analytical methods that the FDA sees for evaluating like regulatory real world evidence for safety or for effectiveness. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to start by saying that there's no one-size-fits-all study design or analytic approach that CDRH finds universally persuasive. What matters most is that the design and the analysis are appropriate for the specific regulatory question, and that the evidence is both relevant and reliable, consistent with our 2017 RWE guidance. One of the things that is really helpful in demonstrating the RWE is relevant and reliable, and we've heard this, Rebecca just said this, we've seen this in some of the other presentations, is to pre-specify what you're doing before you do it. And an RWD study protocol and an accompanying statistical analysis plan can be really helpful in documenting that. And including in that documentation the thoughts that have gone into the data set development. And how could this be helpful? Well, that's by identifying and documenting how bias can enter the study and what mitigations are being proposed and then taken to address all of those potential biases. And biases can arise at any point, from data capture and collection through data curation, defining the study population, creation of the analytic data set, and then ultimately the analytic methods themselves. And each of those steps can introduce different types of bias. And the most persuasive studies are the ones that identify, assess, and mitigate those potential biases in a transparent and systematic way. The key then isn't whether a study uses a particular design, like an RCT or cohort study or a case control study, but rather how well that design fits the regulatory question, and whether the methods used support a valid and relevant inference about safety and effectiveness. We're seeing rigorous approaches that use techniques like propensity score methods and linkages across data sources, and then inclusion of really thoughtful sensitivity analyses that strengthen our ability to draw causal conclusions when randomization isn't feasible. So ultimately, what persuades us isn't the design type per se, but the scientific rigor behind it, whether the evidence is relevant, reliable, and appropriately addresses the decision being made.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Julia. So obviously we talked a little bit about the 2017, information that was out, and there's been some conversations since then with other guidances. What do you think on the latest draft guidance that have come out that maybe you've learned from 2017 that you're applying to the current draft guidance? What are any of the changes maybe that took place that might be good to highlight?
Yeah, sure. So just full disclaimer, until a new guidance becomes final, the 2017 guidance is the one that we operate off of today. But as a lot of you know, our current draft guidance is with OMB at the moment. So hopefully that will be coming out in the near future. I think things that we considered were being added to this draft guidance. We know that folks wanted more examples. There are some generalized examples in there for folks to consider from that perspective. There are several new sections about how real-world evidence can be applied to scenarios under EUA or and also best practices and documentation that's expected when real-world evidence and real-world data is being used. We also wanted to be responsive to the use of real-world data, as you asked earlier, in a wider breadth or a wide breadth of submission types. And this is also to support some requests that were outlined in FDORA or the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform of 2022. And so that's what is, I mean, I think a lot of folks here have seen our draft guidance from 2023. Our next version of, or hopefully soon to be final version of that is with OMB. But until then, our 2017 guidance remains in effect.
And this is a little bit of an obvious question, but it's a good one to ask, is how important is it for sponsors to follow the draft guidance, right? So as they're going through the process, from y'all's perspective?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned, the 2017 guidance is the one that's final and the one that, is from a guidance perspective, the one that we follow until that is replaced with a new one.
Yeah, great. So maybe I think this would be a relevant question for a lot of folks as they, want to make sure as they come to the FDA with more questions and information, like you had said earlier, come early, come often, right? So maybe you can share some of the insights about some of the common mistakes that you've seen take place from folks when it comes to their real world data or real world evidence in their submissions.
Yeah, so I think, as you've heard throughout the time we've had here today, I think pre-specifying is key. And so if you want to know if something's going to work, writing it down, coming to chat with us about that and get our feedback so you can dial that in as you work through the process is very helpful in making sure that the evidence that you generate is relevant and reliable. We consider it credible and accurate and can be considered as part of the total evidence being reviewed for any type of submission. So I think that would be paramount there. I think, as Julia mentioned, thinking through biases are very important. And, real world data is not that different than traditional clinical trial design. Obviously, the operations of implementing it are a little bit different, but thinking through a lot of those lessons learned and pulling that through, thinking about how some biases are mitigated there and what does that mean in the real world data space can also be very helpful in potentially mitigating any types of things that could be problematic down the road. I think, if you do have questions around different biases, come to us. You're welcome to come through QSub process. You're welcome to list either myself or Julia by name if you want to make sure that questions get answered. Those are all helpful tips from that perspective. Maybe I'll pause there and see if Julia has any additional thoughts that could be helpful.
I don't think so. I think, yeah, those are some of the main things that I would emphasize.
Write down what you want to do before you do it.
Yeah.
That come early and come often. So you had mentioned as well that, looking at real world data sufficiently relevant and reliable, so credible and accurate. And what does that look like from a device perspective, from a regulatory submission? How do you determine if that real world data fits that criteria?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start with that one by encouraging anyone interested in specific descriptions of how we assess relevance and reliability to review the 2017 CDRH RWE guidance if you haven't already. And hopefully soon you'll be able to review the new guidance that's currently under review, as Rebecca mentioned, with OMB. But right now, I'm happy to give a high-level overview of how we kind of think about these things. So relevance refers to whether the data are appropriate to address this specific regulatory question. So for example, does the RWD source capture the right patient population, the right device use context, the right outcome measures, and where applicable, the follow-up necessary to evaluate the question at hand? If a data set doesn't include the clinical outcomes, device identifiers, or study population relevant to the decision, then we would not consider it relevant. Reliability, on the other hand, relates to the quality and integrity of the data and the methods used to generate evidence and to analyze it. We look at factors like data completeness, accuracy, consistency, and then the transparency and rigor of the analytic methods. We also consider whether potential sources of bias, as we've mentioned, have been identified and appropriately addressed. For instance, the biases that could occur in data capture, due to missingness or issues with confounding that could ultimately influence the validity of the evidence. And then we also look at how the data are collected, how they're curated, and how they're maintained. So understanding the provenance of the data, or how and why they were collected and under what conditions, is critical. That context helps determine whether the data can be interpreted appropriately for the regulatory question being asked. So when we evaluate RWD sources for potential use in regulatory decision-making, our assessment of relevance and reliability is not a binary yes or no judgment, but rather a contextual evaluation. How well the data source aligns with the regulatory question and what level of uncertainty remains. And then this is dialed into the overall decision in context with the other details and data submitted to the agency. So ultimately what matters is that the data are robust enough in both relevance and reliability to support a credible and scientifically sound regulatory inference.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go with our kind of our last question for the panel. Obviously, there's kind of two questions I want to ask in one. So, you know, we've just continued to expand and move so quickly into, you know, the explosion of wearables, different sensors, patient-reported apps that are coming into play. And I would be remiss if I didn't use the word AI in a webinar today. So I have to ask about how that affects as well. But if you could maybe just talk a little bit about how you're viewing data from these emerging sources, and, you know, any challenges or things that we should be thinking about as we look at that.
Yeah, I can take that. Also a great question. And yeah, data from wearables, sensors, and patient-reported apps have a lot of potential to improve our understanding of patient experiences and the outcomes in real-world settings. I will say, though, we don't always consider data from these sources to be real-world data. So as you've heard earlier, and I'll just say again, we have a unified definition of real-world data across the agency, which is that RWD are data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. So we do not consider data from a wearable sensor or an app to be RWD if they're collected as part of a traditional clinical investigation where the device use is dictated by a controlled research protocol. However, we do consider these data to be RWD when they're collected as part of routine clinical care or everyday use. So with that in mind, if the data are then analyzed to address a specific regulatory question, truly the same considerations of relevance and reliability apply to these data as any other real-world data source. Depending on the specific regulatory question and device type, these sources might actually have some advantages in terms of relevance and reliability. So for instance, continuous monitoring can capture physiological signals, outcomes, or real-world adherence and use patterns that we might not otherwise be able to observe in clinical settings. But there are important caveats to that. A large volume of data does not automatically mean that the data are reliable. So, for example, if the data are systematically missing certain groups, or if users of the device differ meaningfully from the intended use population, the evidence may be biased or not generalizable. And if the device is not capturing the correct information, then we wouldn't consider it relevant. So overall, the technology has a lot of promise, but our evaluation remains the same. We assess how closely the data, how the data were generated, curated, and analyzed, and then whether the data are sufficiently relevant, reliable to support the regulatory decision.
That's great.
I have one example. I worked for 7 years. I worked with a company as a consultant called is it Equine?
Little echo, yeah.
Cardiomems in Atlanta, and they put in a device into the pulmonary artery to measure pulmonary arterial hypertension. So we did it in a clinical trial, but after that, physicians put it into their patients, and it doesn't. You don't need to have a wearable vest or anything like that. It transmits data to a database, and the physicians can use this afterwards. So it's outside of a clinical trial. I would call this real world data, and it's very successful.
Fascinating. Very good stuff. Well, thank you, Julia and Rebecca. I think that was great. I know, obviously, I think a couple of key takeaways for all of us are, as you go through looking at your development and your products, that you get early and often with the FDA to seek guidance, to reach out to find out more information to help you navigate, obviously, in today's world, making sure that you're spending your cash wisely, which is, it's kind of important to make sure that we're doing the right research on the front end so that we can avoid issues. So I thought that was very helpful for giving kind of this overview and guidance. So we do have a couple more minutes left. I'm not sure if there's any questions that have come up. If you have anything that you'd like to, I know some of our panelists have been answering questions throughout the chat during while we've been on here. So I don't see that there's anything specific that came up here, but I'll give it a minute here. Overall, I think though, one of the things I think a big takeaway that I got from this is I think it's important to make sure that as technology, as things continue to evolve, that we don't take, there's a lot of hype, right? There's a lot of things out there that say this is what's going to happen, and the importance of following the regulatory guidance, staying in conjunction with the regulatory bodies to make sure that we're getting the right information and not just the old, just because it was on the internet means it's true, right? So again, I think really important stuff there. So anything else here that we have? Any other questions? I think it looks like we covered most of them. So, well, I'd like to say thank you all for taking the time to join us. First of all, thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate you carving some time out. I know this is a lot of effort and work that went into pulling this all together, and just the insight that you're bringing to the marketplace for all of us. I mean, that was the main reason we wanted to do this, was to share information so that we can all be more efficient and effective as we ultimately are helping patients get the care that they need. And then also I'd like to thank all of the attendees that took time out. We appreciate you guys coming along. We will be making this recording available, as well as we talked about the hyperlinks, so that you can go back and get a chance to review that. We'll also be sending out a survey, I believe, after this to everyone. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd also love to hear if there's other topics. We are in the MedTech, the biotech, pharma space as a company. So we're always looking for great topics that are out there that we can help educate the industry with. So again, thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it. And we hope you have a great rest of the day.